Hello and thank you all for joining us again here today on Hessen County for another SRD talk. This video series takes a look at system reference documents, tech kits, various forms of mechanics that you can mishmash, hack, and put together in order to create some of your own tabletop role-playing game works today, should you wish to. So the one we're going to be taking a look at is this one. This is the Goblin Pulls Out a Gun. This was a tech kit. So in other words, it's not like a full SRD where you could like completely build a game totally out of it, but rather it is a collection of mechanics or a mechanic that would be useful for your game creation. In this case, primarily focusing on the actual dice resolution system. So this was created by Viditya Voleti. They are an artist and a game designer, and some games that they have created you probably have heard of before, like Space Between Stars, Longsword, Space Goblins, A Land Once Magic, Bloodbeam Badlands, which is a vampire game. And the game that I actually was first introduced to Viditya's work was A Fire That Flickers Between You, which actually is a game that does not involve dice at all, but rather instead involves candles, where you and another player, or you by yourself, are a pilot and a mech, and you're trying to basically essentially, this is your last day living. You're going out on a mission where you're going to meet your end. It's probably a suicide mission, and yeah, you're basically exploring your history together in the relationship between the pilot and the mech, and so on and so forth. So what does the Goblin Pulls Out a Gun give you? Well, as I mentioned, it's primarily a dice mechanic that is built on opposing dice pools, and because of that, this actually allows for GM-less play. And the way it's built also allows you to resolve basically multiple actions at the same time, or at least actions that are like coinciding with one another at the same time. So let's go ahead and dive a little bit into exactly how this works. So the player pool starts off as 1d6. So basically you get one 6-sided die is the base amount you can have, and the maximum you can have is 5 6-sided die. And of course, you add dice either by having other characters helping the main character who's doing the action. So for each character, you would add an extra die. For each skill or item that is being used in order to help with this role, you would also add a die. And then finally, any positive circumstances that might be affecting the scene that the characters can take advantage of would also add a die. And again, you can have a max of 5 6-sided die in the player pool. Now, the difficulty pool is 2d8. So the base is 2 8-sided die, and the maximum they can have is the difficulty pool can have in it is 4. So you would be adding dice if the players if the player characters are surprised or outclassed. So if they're really out of their league, then you would add an extra 8-sided die. If there's some sort of a character flaw or some hindrance that the character has that might interfere or create inner turmoil in that character, then you would also add an extra die. So for example, my character's injured, or if my character's having to, fight giant spiders and they have arachnophobia or something. I don't know. That's just the first example that popped in my head. But anyway, you get the idea. Or of course, if there are negative circumstances in the scene, it's dark and raining, and they're trying to do something that would make it more difficult, like identifying someone, or pulling off a shot or something. I don't know. So yeah, these are all different things that could add or basically add dice to one pool or the other. And in this system, there is no base. In the sort of base system, the way it's created here and presented in the text, it doesn't actually contain any way for dice to be removed from the pools. Although I'm guessing that's probably something that you could hack into the system if you wanted to use this for yourself, is potentially have certain types of character flaws or hindrances, actually removing from the player pool instead of adding the difficulty pool. That might be something that you might want to do, especially if your players are the system you're making adds lots of dice to the player pool. So once these dice have been rolled, so let's say, we're building up a pool of like 3, 4, 5 player dice, and you're rolling up against the difficulty dice, the opposition dice, then how are these pools working together? Well, the dice essentially are matched up by the players. So we have the difficulty dice. You roll your difficulty dice. You roll the d8s, and you arrange them in a row, right? And then you're pairing or putting sets of your player dice, your 6-sided dice, in opposition to those. And they can create one of 3 potential results: successes, failures, or collateral. Now, the first one that we see here, this is a success. So here, the player die value, either of the die or dice, the dice set added together, are greater than the difficulty dice. A failure would be any situation where you are able to set up or pair up a player dice with one of the difficulty dice, but the player dice is of a lower value. It doesn't basically you're not overcoming the difficulty or the opposition. And then again, as I mentioned, that final result was a collateral, which is essentially where the results of the player dice and the player dice and the opposition dice are equal to one another. So that is, collateral is essentially success, but with consequences. Which I think actually the collateral is an interesting way to put it. Where basically like you're getting what you want, but you have to basically give something back. Now, as we mentioned, you're not always going to have an equal number of dice. And there might be certain situations where, because of you needing to make groups that you might not have, even if you're rolling more player dice than there are difficulty dice, you might still end up with extra dice there, right? If you want to have lots of successes, but, you want to avoid failures or something, right? But then you end up with extra dice, like in that situation up here, right? You see here. That is called a catastrophe, which is an extra bad failure. It's basically like a no and something bad happens. However, there might be certain situations where, for example, in that one right there, we have an extra die. So in this example that you see here off to my off to the side here, we have a 5 paired with a 6, so that's a success, and we have a 2 paired with a 2, so that's a collateral. But then we have an extra player die. This is a spectacle. A spectacle is basically an overblown success. So in some ways, it's very similar to a collateral in that you are gaining what you wanted. However, you're doing it in such an overblown and obscene way, or you're doing it in such a way that creates so much attention that it's so over the top that it comes with its own disadvantages. Or you might end up like basically burning yourself because you've succeeded too much. So like, for example, if I were playing in that particular case, what you might want to do is put that 2 with that 1, put the 2 and the 1 together as a set, and then just go with 2 successes instead of a success, a collateral, and a spectacle. Now, one interesting way that the rules kind of suggest in the examples of like ways that you could interpret these results are that you could have each of these different results, the success, the failure, the collateral, or whatever, to apply to different players or different situations that are happening in the exact same scene, or different characters rather, not players. So like, for example, let's say the players are a team of operatives. They're trying to sneak into the base of the supervillain. Let's say this is like a James Bond movie, right? So here, again, we have a success, a collateral, and a spectacle, right? So let's say the success is somebody is trying to disable the security system. So they manage to sneak in and they disable the security system just fine. Let's say the collateral would be maybe another player has encountered a guard and is having to fight against that guard. And they do manage to defeat the guard, but it ends up, they end up getting injured, let's say. Like, they're wrestling the gun. And let's say they manage to get the gun away and they, shoot the guard, and obviously disable them. But in the process, they get wounded. Or they end up putting themselves in a dangerous situation, like they manage to get the gun and they shoot the other guard, or they're wrestling with the guard and the guard falls off a cliff, but they end up partly falling off the cliff and they're kind of hanging on for dear life, that kind of situation. And then the spectacle would be like the guy who comes in on the dirt, who comes flying down the valley in a dirt bike, setting off explosives everywhere, attracting way too much attention. But managing to sabotage whatever it is they intended on sabotaging. Anyway, so that's just an example of a way that you can interpret this. Or you can have basically like, I'm trying to do X, and then once you get the dice rolls, then you can set up a situation, a series of events affecting just your character that might potentially happen as a result of this roll. So again, maybe all three of those things could happen to the same character. All right, so what are some ways that you could potentially hack this? Well, there's some suggestions, of course, in the system. One, of course, being you could change up the dice or the pools, or how you put together the pools, or what makes things add. Or you could set up rules where things can pool dice out of pools, which I mentioned previously. Again, maybe we want our dice values to be the same. Maybe we want to change our values so that we've got, 12s and 20s or something like that. There could be lots of different ways you could do it. Or you could have certain rule systems involved with certain character classes or abilities, which I'll mention in a minute, where it changes the dice. Or it presets values of certain dice. Like whenever you're doing a certain action, if you have this character class, maybe or playbook or whatever, this ability, maybe it allows you to auto set the value of one die in your roll instead of, whether you can make it good or bad or whatever. Another thing you could do is you could change some of the rules on catastrophes and spectacles, like removing them entirely or just doing with one or the other. Again, as I mentioned, characters, of course, right? Whenever you're creating character, you need to create rules for characters and like how many items or abilities they can have or how they get them. And of course, advancement and all that stuff. None of that, of course, is included here. So these are all things that you're going to want to layer on, especially if you want this to be more than just a one-shot, sort of very simple one-shot system. You could also add in, rules for additional dice modification or special results. So with the additional dice manipulation, as I mentioned, maybe you'll have certain abilities or classes where the character can, set the value of a die or add extra die or re-roll certain die or stuff like that. Or in the case of special results, maybe if I roll nothing but successes, something special happens, like a critical success, right? Not a spectacle, but like an actual good critical success. Or maybe if I roll nothing but failures that can cause injuries to my character or something, and if once I achieve a certain number, I'm disabled or removed from the game. Or maybe something happens to the character and I have to roll a new one or whatever. And then finally, of course, another way you can hack the system is by adding a GM. This system is set up to be GM-less, but of course you could have a GM be involved. And then the question becomes, if you are involving a GM in the Goblin Pulls Out a Gun, what is their role going to be, right? Are they going to be rolling the opposition? Are they going to be rolling the opposition dice, or not? Is the player going to be rolling those? Or players. If the GM is not rolling the dice, then what are they doing? Aside from like maybe telling some elements of opposition, or making sure things are kind of fair to a certain extent, or just sort of helping out with like keeping track of everything, because of course, as you know, keeping track of things and playing all of the non NPCs and stuff like that in a role-playing game where you don't have a GM can sometimes be a little complicated for the group, especially if all the characters are involved in all scenes all the time. So that could be a potential role. The GM is essentially there like all of the extras, all of the major NPCs and the extras they're playing them. So thank you all for joining us again here on Hessens County, taking a look at The Goblin Pulls Out a Gun by Viditya Voleti. So now it's time for you to get your goblin loading and figure out how you're potentially going to use this system in creating some games of your own. Again, links to this can be this sort of tech kit can be found in the doobly-doo down below on itch. And don't forget to like, subscribe, especially if you enjoy taking a look and diving into and exploring some of these systems. And don't forget to rate your itch purchases, especially this one, and have a good zone.